Ever heard someone described as having laconic wit? Like they're cleverly concise.
Right.
Well, it actually comes from the Spartans, from Laconia, a region in ancient Greece.
Interesting.
And speaking of Spartans, today we're doing a deep dive into their army, going way beyond those Hollywood stereotypes to see what made them such a force for centuries.
It's easy to get stuck on the whole six-pack abs and bronze armor image.
Right.
But their success was about so much more than just brute strength. It was tied to their entire society, their values, even their culture.
Yeah, this wasn't just an army. It was their whole way of life. We're talking kids starting military training at, 7 years old.
7.
The Yoga Goj, as their training system was called, was definitely intense. But it wasn't just about being cruel. It aimed to instill things like austerity, obedience, being cunning, qualities they needed for their military doctrine.
So training the body and the mind. I read they even learn to read and write, appreciate poetry, not just your typical dumb, brute image.
Exactly, and that literacy served a purpose. Understanding battle plans, communicating on the field, analyzing the enemy, these guys were strategic thinkers.
Speaking of strategy, we got to talk about the phalanx formation. Basically, an ancient Greek tank made of shields and spears.
Right, and as effective as the phalanx was, it relied heavily on discipline, on everyone working together seamlessly, something the Spartans perfected through constant drilling. Their obedience, their ability to hold that formation, that's what made them so hard to beat.
But even the mighty Spartans had to adapt, right? Warfare was always evolving.
Absolutely. Over time, they came up against enemies with new tactics, new technologies, and they had to become more flexible, like when they encountered the peltasts.
Peltasts.
Lighter troops, armed with javelins. It forced the Spartans to change up their strategies, rely less on their heavy armor for every encounter.
So they're willing to learn from their enemies, adapt to new situations. That's something that's still relevant today, don't you think? Whether we're talking about a literal battlefield or even the business world, being adaptable is key.
Absolutely. And speaking of adaptation, here's something you might not expect. The Spartans had a navy.
Really? I always thought of them as a purely land-based power.
They were primarily a land power, sure, but they knew how important naval power was strategically, especially in a place like ancient Greece with all the islands, all the coastal cities.
Makes sense. Can't control trade routes or defend your shores without some ships.
Exactly. And this became especially important during the Peloponnesian War, when Sparta was up against Athens, a city-state known for its naval strength. This war really highlights the Spartans in action, showcasing their military might on a larger scale.
Right, the Peloponnesian War, one of the most famous conflicts in ancient Greek history. And it wasn't just about brute force either. They had this whole code of honor, right, that influenced how they fought.
Absolutely. Their social structure played a huge role in their military might. They had 3 main classes: the Spartiates, the Perioeci, and the Helots. Each group had its own place.
Okay, break that down for me. Who were these groups and what did they have to do with the army?
So, the Spartiates, they were the elite, the full citizens. Their whole lives were dedicated to military service. These were the hoplites, the heavily armed infantrymen, the backbone of the Spartan army.
So being a Spartan warrior wasn't just a job, it was like their entire identity.
Precisely. From childhood, they went through the agoj, that harsh training, that strict lifestyle, all to mold them into disciplined soldiers. Couldn't engage in trade, couldn't have other professions. Their only purpose was to be warriors.
Wow, that's commitment. But what about the other groups you mentioned, the Perioeci and the Helots?
The Perioeci, they were free, but not full citizens, often merchants, craftsmen, even sailors. They served as light infantry and support, which was valuable to the Spartan army. The Helots, though, they were essentially state-owned serfs. They worked the land, providing the agricultural backbone for Sparta.
So you've got a very clear social hierarchy there.
And that hierarchy is key to understanding their military dominance. The Spartiates could dedicate themselves to warfare because those other classes were there to support that way of life.
It's fascinating how their society was structured around their military. But let's go back to the Spartiates for a minute. We touched on their training, but what did it actually involve?
Imagine this: 7 years old, taken from your home, enrolled in the agoj, living in communal barracks, enduring hardship, meager rations, constantly being tested. Your courage, your endurance, everything.
Intense. Like some kind of ancient boot camp, but cranked up to 11.
Not a bad way to put it. They trained extensively in weapons handling, of course, but also stealth, hunting, survival skills. They were taught to endure pain without complaint, to value duty and discipline above all else.
Essentially molded into the ultimate fighting machines from a young age. No wonder they were so formidable in battle.
And it wasn't just about physical strength. Mental fortitude was key. The Spartans firmly believed a strong mind was just as important as a strong body, especially when things got rough.
It makes me think of those stories about Spartan mothers telling their sons to come back with their shield or on it. Pretty chilling, but also kind of inspiring.
That saying really sums up their warrior ethos. Courage, self-sacrifice, that's what mattered. A Spartan warrior was expected to fight bravely, never retreat.
So did they have, like, official rules of engagement, or was it more about this unspoken code of honor?
They didn't have written codes of conduct like we think of today, but their actions were definitely guided by unwritten rules, expectations. For example, showing fear or anger in battle, that was a big no-no.
Really? That seems kind of counterintuitive, especially in the heat of the moment. Wouldn't a little fear or anger be, I don't know, natural?
Maybe, but Spartans believed those emotions clouded your judgment and led to mistakes. A Spartan warrior was supposed to stay disciplined, stay composed, even when facing death. Controlled aggression, not blind rage.
So calmness under pressure, that was key. What else was part of this code of honor?
Here's something interesting. They had a deep respect for their opponents, at least those they considered worthy adversaries. Cowardice, that was the ultimate disgrace. For themselves and their enemies, it really makes you think. That respect for worthy adversaries adds another layer to their image, doesn't it? These fierce warriors who also valued honor and respect, even in the midst of battle.
It's a fascinating paradox. Brutality and honor all mixed together shows just how different their worldview was from ours. It makes you wonder how those values actually played out in their tactics and strategies on the battlefield.
Well, the Spartans didn't see warfare as just brute force or individual heroics. For them, it was calculated, disciplined, almost like a game of chess.
Oh, a game of chess. Now that's an interesting analogy. What were some of their key moves, so to speak?
Maneuvering and deception were big for them. They were masters of feints, flanking maneuvers, using those tactics to outsmart their opponents. And they were picky about where they fought, too.
I bet. Couldn't exactly pull off that phalanx formation in a forest, could they?
Exactly. Open terrain was key, where they could use the phalanx to its fullest and exploit their superior discipline. And something else they understood, which might surprise some people, was the importance of logistics, of supply lines.
So it wasn't just about charging into battle. They actually planned for the long game.
Oh, absolutely. A successful campaign meant careful planning, careful execution, making sure their troops had the supplies they needed, having a clear objective in mind. These campaigns could drag on for months, even years. Brute force wasn't enough. They had to think ahead.
So these weren't just skilled warriors. They were strategists, too. Really challenges the image of them as just muscle-bound fighters, huh?
It does. They understood military tactics and logistics on a deeper level. For example, they tried to avoid prolonged sieges whenever possible.
Why was that? You'd think laying siege to a city would be a pretty effective way to force a surrender?
It could be, in theory. But sieges were resource-intensive. They could tie you down for a long time, sap your manpower. The Spartans knew their strength was being mobile, decisive. If they couldn't take a city quickly, they'd often try to draw their enemy out into open battle.
So they used their enemy's strengths against them. And if that didn't work,
They'd look for weaknesses in the city's defenses, maybe even try some subterfuge to get inside. There are accounts of them using spies, spreading disinformation, even resorting to stealth to infiltrate enemy strongholds.
wow, pretty sneaky. They were more adaptable in their tactics than their reputation for discipline and tradition would suggest.
That's an important point. They were disciplined, yes, but not inflexible. They understood that different situations, different opponents called for different approaches. Remember, they weren't fighting the same enemy over and over. The ancient Greek world was a complex web of alliances and rivalries. They had to adapt to survive.
Seems like that adaptability, combined with their disciplined training, made them a force to be reckoned with.
Indeed. It wasn't just brute force. It was about outsmarting their opponents, playing the long game, and constantly adapting to the changing nature of warfare. This strategic thinking was crucial to their many victories, especially against larger armies like the Persians at Thermopylae and Plataea.
Speaking of Thermopylae, that is to be one of the most famous battles in history, even if it wasn't a Spartan victory.
Ah, Thermopylae. The ultimate example of Spartan courage and discipline, even against impossible odds.
Okay, for those who might not be as familiar with the details, could you set the scene for us?
Picture this. A vast Persian army led by Xerxes I is marching on Greece. The Greeks, realizing what's at stake, band together a coalition of city-states to resist this invasion.
A true clash of civilizations. This wasn't just some border skirmish, it was about their very way of life.
Exactly. And who better to defend against this threat than the Spartans, known throughout Greece for their military prowess? They were tasked with holding a narrow pass at Thermopylae. This pass was essentially a bottleneck, a choke point that could slow the massive Persian army and give the Greeks a fighting chance.
Now, I remember reading that the Spartan force at Thermopylae was comparatively small. Is that true?
It is. The Spartan contingent, led by King Leonidas, numbered only around 300 Spartiates. They had allies from other Greek city-states, of course, but all told, maybe around 7,000 men.
Wow. And they were facing the might of the Persian Empire. What were they thinking?
It might seem crazy, but it was actually a solid strategy. You see, they knew the narrow terrain would negate the Persian advantage in numbers. It would force them to funnel their forces, creating a choke point.
So they used the landscape itself as a weapon.
Precisely. And for 2 days, the Spartans and their allies held that pass against wave after wave of Persian attacks. Can you imagine the courage it must have taken to stand against such overwhelming odds?
2 days. It's almost unimaginable, holding off a force that large for that long. How outnumbered were they? Do we know how big that Persian army actually was?
Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, he claimed it was millions strong. Modern historians believe that's probably an exaggeration, but even so, the Persian force was still overwhelmingly large, likely numbering in the hundreds of thousands.
So even if it wasn't millions, we're still talking about a serious David and Goliath situation here. How did the Spartans manage to hold them off for so long?
Well, the terrain was a huge factor, as we discussed. But on top of that, you've got the Spartans' superior training, their discipline, their heavier armor and weaponry. All those things gave them an edge in those close quarters engagements. The Persians were essentially fighting the Spartans on their terms.
It really highlights the effectiveness of the phalanx formation and the Spartans' discipline. But we all know how this story ends. How did their stand at Thermopylae finally come to an end?
Well, on the third day, a local shepherd betrayed the Greeks. He revealed a secret path through the mountains, a way for the Persians to get behind the Spartan lines.
No. A traitor in their midst. That's awful, especially after such a valiant defense.
A classic twist of fate, isn't it? With this element of surprise, a Persian force was able to outflank the Spartans, effectively surrounding them.
So they were trapped. What happened then?
King Leonidas, realizing there was no way out, he made a difficult choice. He dismissed most of the allied Greek forces, allowing them to retreat, to live, to fight another day.
A true leader, sacrificing himself for the greater good.
Indeed. Leonidas, he stayed behind with his 300 Spartans, along with a few Thespians and Thebans who chose to stay. They made a heroic last stand against the advancing Persians. It's said they fought with unmatched ferocity, knowing that their sacrifice would buy time for the rest of Greece to prepare.
And that act of defiance, that unwavering courage, that's what cemented their place in history.
It is. Even though they ultimately fell, their sacrifice wasn't in vain. It bought precious time for the other Greek city-states to regroup and ultimately to defeat the Persian invasion at the Battle of Salamis.
So even in defeat, their actions helped to turn the tide of the war. They might have lost the battle, but their sacrifice helped win the war.
Exactly. The Battle of Thermopylae, it became a symbol of Spartan bravery, of their discipline, their self-sacrifice. It cemented their legacy as some of the fiercest warriors in history and highlighted how effective the phalanx formation could be when used correctly, even against a much larger force.
It's an incredible story. Their courage, even in the face of certain death, is really remarkable. It's hard to imagine having that level of dedication. But even the Spartans, with their legendary discipline and a military prowess, they weren't invincible, were they? Eventually, they experienced a decline.
It's true. Like all great powers throughout history, the Spartans eventually declined. Their fall from power, it was complex, a gradual erosion of their power and influence over time. It reminds us that even the mightiest empires aren't immune to the forces of history.
So what were some of the key factors in their decline? Was it a single catastrophic event, or more of a gradual unraveling?
I'd say it was more of a perfect storm of factors. One of the most significant was their rigid social structure. While that strict hierarchy, with the Spartiates at the top, contributed to their early dominance, it also became a major weakness in the long run.
That's interesting. It seems counterintuitive. Their social structure was so integral to their military success. How did it end up hurting them?
It was inflexible. The Spartan citizenry, the Spartiate class in particular, it was shrinking. Their constant wars, their strict upbringing, it all led to high casualty rates. And their social system, well, it made it difficult to replenish their ranks.
So too few Spartans to go around.
Essentially, yes. And since only those born into the Spartiate class could be full citizens, with military responsibilities, their pool of potential soldiers kept getting smaller. This manpower shortage was a major blow to their military strength.
So their very success, which was built on this limited warrior class, ultimately contributed to their decline.
Ironically, yes. And as the number of Spartiates dwindled, so did their political influence, their control over their allies. They were losing their grip on power, both from within and without.
Internal weakness breeding external instability. A tale as old as time. Were there other factors at play in their decline?
Absolutely. On top of their shrinking numbers, the Spartans were also facing economic challenges. Their rigid social structure, great for churning out soldiers, wasn't so great for economic innovation.
This is interesting. We haven't really touched on the economic side of things yet. What was the economic situation in Sparta like? Were they a wealthy city-state?
Their economy was primarily agrarian, heavily reliant on agriculture and land ownership. Remember, the Helots worked the land, which was owned by the Spartiates. This system, while it worked for a while, ended up stifling innovation and growth.
So while other city-states were embracing trade, commerce, new technologies, Sparta clung to its traditional system.
Exactly. Other Greek city-states, like Athens, they were diversifying their economies, amassing wealth through trade. Sparta, though, they stuck with their agrarian system, which put them at a disadvantage.
It sounds like they were getting left behind, economically and technologically. Did this directly impact their military?
It did. Their lack of economic dynamism made it harder to maintain a strong military over time. They simply couldn't keep up with the advancements in weaponry and technology that other city-states were developing. Essentially, they were being outspent and outgunned by their rivals.
To sum it up, manpower shortages, a rigid social structure that couldn't adapt, and economic stagnation. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It certainly didn't help. And if those internal problems weren't enough, the Spartans were also facing increasing external pressure. Rival city-states, sensing weakness, saw an opportunity to challenge them.
Sounds like they were under pressure from all sides. Who were some of their main rivals during this period of decline?
One of their most formidable opponents was Thebes, another powerful city-state. The Thebans, under the leadership of Epaminondas, a brilliant strategist, were growing in strength and influence, and they weren't afraid to challenge Sparta's dominance.
I'm sensing a showdown brewing. What happened between the Spartans and the Thebans? Did they actually come to blows?
They did. The two powers clashed at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. This battle was a turning point for the Spartans.
What happened at Leuctra? What made it so significant?
The Thebans, with Epaminondas leading the charge, they used innovative tactics and really exploited Spartan weaknesses. The result was a crushing defeat for the Spartan army, shattering their image of invincibility.
Wow, a crushing defeat. That must have been a huge blow to their morale, their reputation.
It was devastating. The Battle of Leuctra really marked a turning point. It effectively ended their reign as the top dog in ancient Greece. They weren't the undisputed masters of war anymore. Their weaknesses had been exposed, and their rivals knew it.
So Leuctra was the beginning of the end for them. Did they ever recover?
While they continued to exist as a city-state for centuries after Leuctra, they never fully regained their former glory. Their aura of invincibility was gone, and other city-states smelling blood in the water were eager to challenge them. They faced more defeats, more internal strife, and gradually faded from prominence.
It's almost tragic, isn't it, to see a once great power decline like that, even if it was all those centuries ago. It makes you wonder. Any final thoughts about the decline of the Spartan army? Any lessons we can learn from their fall from grace?
The Spartan story, it's a cautionary tale. It reminds us that even the most powerful empires, the most formidable military forces, they're not immune to the forces of history. They were masters of adaptation for a time, but eventually their rigid social structure, their economic stagnation, their inability to fully adapt to a changing world, it all caught up with them.
A stark reminder that adaptability, innovation, a willingness to change, those things are essential for long-term survival, wouldn't you say?
Couldn't agree more. The Spartan story really drives that point home.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Tactics, their last stand at Thermopylae, their eventual decline. But there's another side to the Spartans we haven't really explored yet. They weren't just warrior strategists. They had a rich cultural tradition too, didn't they?
They did. We tend to focus on their military achievements, but it's important to remember they were a complex society with their own unique cultural expressions.
I'm ready for a change of pace. Tell me, what was Spartan culture like beyond the battlefield? So we've talked about their military strategies, their discipline, their decline, but you mentioned earlier that they weren't just warriors, they had a cultural side too.
Absolutely. We tend to focus on their military, but the Spartans had a surprisingly rich culture.
It's fascinating how easily we can stereotype historical figures.
Yeah.
What else can you tell us about Spartan life beyond the battlefield?
Well, poetry and music, for example, played a much bigger role than you might think, though of course it often served different purposes compared to other Greek city-states.
Okay, now I'm curious. When we think of ancient Greece, it's all Homer's epics, Sappho's lyrics. What kind of poetry did the Spartans go for?
Their poetry, much like their lifestyle, was often austere, to the point. Not about flowery language or romance, it was about duty, honor, courage, glorifying Spartan values.
So, more about reinforcing their way of life than, I don't know, escapism. Would you call it a form of, like, lyrical propaganda?
In a way, yes. One of their most famous poets was Tyrtaeus, from the 7th century BC. His lifetime coincided with a really critical time for Sparta, the Second Messenian War.
That was a close call for them, wasn't it? Fighting for their survival against the Messenians.
Exactly, and Tyrtaeus's poetry played a role in rallying the Spartan people during that war. His verses are all about bravery, urging people to fight for their city, to face death with courage.
Sounds powerful. Do we have any examples of his work? What do these Spartan battle cries sound like?
Unfortunately, only fragments have survived. But one of his most famous lines is, "For 'tis a fair thing for a good man to fall fighting in the van for his native land."
Wow. Short,
Yeah.
impactful, very Spartan. They weren't known for beating around the bush, were they?
Not at all. That's where we get the word laconic from, their region, Laconia. Brevity, directness in their speech, in their poetry.
So even their words were a weapon. It's amazing how everything seems to connect back to their warrior ethos.
It was deeply ingrained in their culture. But it's also important to remember that even though their poetry often had a militaristic purpose, it also shows a deep love for their homeland, a profound respect for those who sacrificed themselves for it.
It's a side of them we don't always see, right? It wasn't just blind obedience, bloodlust.
No. Their poetry shows a more complex mix of emotions, pride, patriotism, duty, but also an awareness of the tragedy of war, of the sacrifices it demanded. It makes them seem more human, don't you think?
It does. It's easy to forget, looking back at ancient cultures, that they were human too, with emotions, questions, experiencing life just like we do.
Exactly. And their poetry gives us a glimpse into their hearts, their minds, reminding us of that shared humanity.
You mentioned philosophy earlier. Did they have their own schools of thought, like the Athenians with Socrates and Plato?
They didn't have formal philosophical schools in the same way, no. But they did have a strong philosophical tradition, though it was less about abstract concepts and more about, I'd say, practical wisdom, the art of living a virtuous life.
So less about pondering the meaning of life and more about, like, living it according to their values.
Precisely. Their philosophy was intertwined with their way of life. They believed in simplicity, austerity, striving for excellence in everything they did, on the battlefield, in their political life, even their personal conduct.
So philosophy is a way of life. Were there any specific Spartans who exemplified this?
One of the most influential figures was Lycurgus, their lawgiver.
Wait, wasn't Lycurgus the one who supposedly set up the Agoge, that brutal training system?
The very same. He's shrouded in legend, and some historians even question whether he was a real person or a combination of different reformers, but he's credited with shaping Spartan society, their way of life.
He's like the mysterious founding father of Spartan culture.
That's a great way to put it. He's credited with establishing the Ephyret, that council of elders that held a lot of power, and also with instilling the values of equality, at least among the Spartiate class, austerity, military discipline, the things that define Spartan culture.
It's amazing how one person, even a possibly mythical one, can have such a lasting impact.
It shows the power of ideas. Whether Lycurgus was real or not, he embodies that Spartan ideal, selfless, disciplined, dedicated to the state.
A stark contrast to a lot of the power-hungry rulers we hear about.
Very true. And while their methods, the Spartans' methods, were often harsh, even brutal by today's standards, their goal, at least in theory, was to create a society where everyone was equal, dedicated to the common good, at least within the citizen class, of course.
A noble goal, even if their methods were a bit, shall we say, extreme.
Absolutely. But that's what's so great about studying history. It allows us to challenge our own assumptions, look at different ways of life, even if we don't always agree with them.
Couldn't have put it better myself. This has been quite a journey. We've gone from the heights of their military power to their training methods, their poetry, their philosophy. The Spartans were much more than just warriors, weren't they?
They were a complex and fascinating society, that's for sure. Their story, with all its ups and downs, it still captures our imaginations all these centuries later.
It really does.
Good.
And on that note, a huge thank you to you, our expert, for guiding us on this deep dive into the world of the Spartan Army.
It's been my pleasure.
And to you, our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you've learned something new, maybe challenged your own assumptions, and come away with a new appreciation for this ancient culture. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop diving deep into the endlessly fascinating world of history.